Something. I am your host and creator of the show, Deedre Daniel. This podcast is all about how to live a more fascinating life. And we are learning how to do that one interesting conversation at a time. We stay away from discussing politics, religion, and the ad nauseum topic du jour, but pretty much anything else is fair game. And today I am speaking with Valerie Gordon. Val, who I like to call her Val, has won 10 Emmys. 10. And she has made a living producing stories that educate, entertain, and inspire. She understands how our own internal stories impact our external results. And she recently wrote a book called Your Narrator, which addresses how to wrangle that voice inside your head that is preventing you from reaching your goals. She recently rebranded a company, and we're going to discuss how she's helping people to rewrite their story in a more strategic way. We have lots to talk about today. Welcome, Val.
Thank you, Deedre. So happy to be with you as always.
Before we jump in, I wanted you to know that I was enthusiastically describing this upcoming podcast with a friend of mine who does not watch TV, and she said, "What's an Emmy?"
Really?
Yes, she did. And I thought, well, I guess we're going to have to address that for some people. So, Val, what is an Emmy and how did you win 10 of them?
Well, I'm curious, your friend, does she know what an Oscar is, or is she just really
Oh, yeah,
living
she very
under,
much,
under
yes,
a
she know,
rock?
yes. So she knows what an Oscar is, but she did not know what an Emmy is.
Okay, fair enough. So an Emmy is the Television National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences gives awards for television work. My Emmys, and I knew you were going to start there, Deedre, because you are so fascinated by them for some reason. And I tell people that I think this is the least interesting thing about me, but sure, let's start there. Go ahead. My Emmys are in the sports category. So I spent more than 20 years working in national networks for both sports and news. And I do have some of them behind me. Yes, good props in my home office. And I worked on features. So I told all the stories that were behind the scenes, you know, the coach, the athlete, the celebrity, the everyday, regular, real life person, and the triumph over adversity that they had. So all of those off-field stories, those really colorful, personable stories. And there are categories for the sports Emmys that range from live event turnaround. One of these is for an Olympics I worked on, to best edited series. I was a producer for some time for a news magazine show called Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel, and best long feature, best short feature, etc. So that's where these come from. And it's sort of like any industry award, right? That if you do a good job and you happen to be on someone's radar or credit list, sometimes you get one of these trophies. But I do tell people it's not as if it's not, my Emmys are not from that big award ceremony. For those of you who know what the Emmys are and watch them on television, you see the red carpet and you see all the prime time. Those are the primetime Emmys. There's daytime Emmys, there's news Emmys, there's regional Emmys. These are sports Emmys. Our event was held in New York City every year, and they would give them out. And I was very lucky in my career to work with teams of really talented people, producers, reporters, writers. And each one of these is an absolute team effort, which is one reason why I think I have trouble owning them as like, well, Val has 10 Emmys, because of course, so much more goes into it. It wasn't just me. I was part of a really high performing team, and this is the result.
Well, it's still 10 more Emmys than I have. I think it's very impressive. They look sharp, pointy, and dangerous. Have you ever stabbed anyone with one?
I haven't stabbed anyone with one, but you are right. They are pointy. I actually did injure myself though once on my own trophy. I was moving items out of my office. I was walking downstairs to my basement, precariously carrying several of them, and items started slipping from my hands. And I didn't want to drop the Emmy, because it was like, don't drop the Emmy. And I
Right.
grabbed it and sort of punctured my hand on, yes, what you can sort of see looks like a sharp, it's like an angel wing.
Uh-huh.
Very painful, was bandaged up for some days, did not know whether I was going to need a tetanus shot. And in some ways, very symbolic of my TV career, which was exciting and fulfilling, and also really hard and heartbreaking when I left it. And in some ways, earning those Emmys and all the hours that were put in, and then injuring myself on an Emmy, it's somewhat symbolic of the pain you have to go through for a really challenging career. And I
Yeah.
think also the pain in leaving it. Although, of course, because I believe everything is a story, leaving my TV career really led to my next chapter, which is all about helping other people with their next chapters.
Do you have a favorite? Is there one that you look at and you're like, oh, this was my favorite story, my favorite project?
That's a great question. The first one was really exciting, even though I was such a minion. I was so low on the totem pole. This was for live event turnaround for NBC's coverage of the 1996 Olympics.
Okay.
And I was actually probably not supposed to get one of them. I was actually an assistant to the producers, and that's not sort of an Emmy-worthy category, but because I had worked for so long in this department and so many hours, someone, I guess, put me on the credit list. And that was exciting because it was the first one. But I
Uh-huh.
will say there are other ones here for which I know I made an impact on the script supervision, on making sure that the piece in its final edit really was going to have the compelling impact that we wanted it to have. And so, one of those was a story about a boy who grew up with no arms and became a NASCAR engineer and used his feet to control his computer keyboard to be able to live out his dream of being a full potential person who could work in the field that he loved. His name was Richie Parker. I was a supervising producer on it. All credit to the producer, Lawrence Stowell, for bringing his story to life. And then when you go to the award ceremony, and Richie Parker is there too, and this is really his award because it's his story. And like I said, I was just one person there to bring his story to life.
Oh, that's incredible. It really is. I love that story. I can see why you picked that one. So how did you get into that line of work, Val?
So, as a communications major in college, I was sort of enamored of television, and that's where I started off. My first job, actually, after college, was at VH1, the music station, so long ago that it was when they had the dash in their name. And I
Uh-huh.
spent about 2 years there, and I remember thinking that, unlike any of my colleagues who were so into the music scene, I really didn't care if Hootie and the Blowfish was, dropping a new album. They were sort of big at the time.
Uh-huh.
But I remember being a kid who loved the Olympic Games. And that had been my goal as a kid, was to go to the Olympics,
Uh-huh.
actually. So it's kind of crazy, of course. I didn't have any real talent to actually go to the Olympics as an athlete, but I wound up going to two. Again, the 1996 Games in Atlanta and the
Mhm.
1998 Winter Olympics in Nagano, Japan, as a member of the broadcast team. So that initial childhood dream of loving the Olympics kind of came true. I left VH1, I took the job with NBC, and learned how to tell a really great, compelling story from some of the producers that I worked with. And then I spent the next 15, 18 years traveling around the country, producing stories, working for different networks, and then ultimately supervising those stories that you would see on TV at my last stop, which was ESPN.
Well, you're really good at it. You recently rebranded your company the Storytelling Strategist. And how are you helping people through strategic storytelling?
So it was actually 5 years ago when I left my last TV gig and formed a company based on strategic storytelling. I really wanted to help, in particular, women. Because I saw so many talented women during my time in sports television opt out, drop out, fall back, or really not reach the level that their skill and talent, should have had them reach. And I thought a lot about, well, how do I merge my two interests, my love of storytelling, my knowledge of storytelling, and my desire to help women better advance themselves at work? And I thought it's really so much about knowing your story, the value that you bring, and how to tell it. When
Uh-huh.
you think about it, everything is a story: how we interview, how we network, the stories we tell about ourselves, how we negotiate. When you go into that scene, what do you say to get the optimal outcome? And based on that idea, I started a career and communication strategy company focused on the power of storytelling, really understanding your own story, how to tell it for impact and influence, and how to rewrite it yourself, meaning for everyone feeling stuck in their career or unhappy with where they are, how can we use the elements of storytelling to invigorate your own story and get you thinking about what might come next? And the rebrand happened recently when I realized that I needed a title for my company that better explained what I do. And I had some very good friends help me with that title. And so, yes, it is called the Storytelling Strategist. And now I use my experience putting stories on television to help audiences and clients understand the power in their own stories. And I speak at conferences, still do a lot of work with women's conferences, but I also do a lot of work with corporations, training future leaders and training teams. How do you build stronger teams by understanding everybody comes into the same project, the same scenario with a different story? How do you make the most of that? And for as difficult as it was to leave the corporate world and start something new, I feel this is very much my story. My story now is about helping other people develop and tell their own stories. And it is some of the most challenging and fulfilling work that I've ever done.
That's great. So, how important is the narrator in personal storytelling?
And I love that you brought it up. Obviously, it's the topic of my book. So every story has to have three main key elements. You can't have a story without it. They are character. Your story needs to be about someone. Plot, something needs to happen in the story. There's some type of action. And narrative point of view, which is the voice or the tone of the story, how it's told. So in translating these three elements to how we think about our own personal storytelling, that narrative point of view is what I call your inner narrator. It's sort of like that voice in your head that sets the tone for your day. It's the voice of your own story. So a lot of people think of this as the inner critic. Many of us are familiar with that term, the inner critic. We have a voice in our head that is harshly rebuking us when we make mistakes or, not saying nice things to us. But in my speaking with clients, I actually identified 10 narrative types that I found most people fell into based on things we would say to ourselves. So if you think about that inner narrator, let's say you get up in the morning, you're running late for work, you get to work or your desk, wherever you're working from, and the first thing you do is you spill your giant iced coffee all over your desk. What did you just say to yourself? That's a clue to your inner narrator, how you speak to yourself, and what is the impact of that on the rest of your day. So that narrative point of view, that tone or voice of the story sets the framework with how we view the world, and we choose actions based upon that. So of all the characters in our story, the most influential is what I would consider to be your inner narrator. Is that inner voice helping or hurting you? And are you even aware of it? So I'd be curious, Deedre, when I give you that scenario, spilling your coffee, let's say all over your recording equipment, you probably wouldn't bring coffee into your studio, but if you did, what would be the first thing you would think or say to yourself?
Oh, I'd probably call myself a klutz. I would completely scold myself, and I would also think about it over and over again. I would tell people, I'm such an idiot. I spilled, my beverage all over my really expensive equipment. And I ruined it, and I have to go out and buy more.
Right. And so what you're describing is obviously both the critical narrator, or that inner critic type, but also the ruminating narrator, because you talked about not being able to forget it. So when I talk to audiences, I ask often, like, who can remember a mistake that you made yesterday? And a lot of hands go up. Okay. Well, who's still thinking about a mistake you made 8 years ago? And the people who ruminate know what I'm talking about, because that's the stuff that wakes you up in the middle of the night when you remember something that you regret or an embarrassing situation from many years ago. And as you relive it in your brain, again, that's your narrator talking to you, you feel the same sort of emotion or shame or feelings of regret. So the critical narrator is perhaps the most common and the one that most people are familiar with it. But you've also described the ruminating narrator. If you keep coming back to that time, you spilled your coffee on your equipment or whatever it is. And when you think about it, having that narrative point of view, that narrator in our head, is that helping or hurting you? Because each of these characteristics, these narrative types, can be helpful. It is probably a good idea to remember, the last time I brought iced coffee in here, I made a mess. So maybe I should make sure the lid is on this
Mhm.
time. So in some ways it can help us. The question becomes, when does it get in our way? It gets in the way of the future story if we're always thinking about those past memories. And because there's real science behind story, and human beings have a tendency to remember negative events over positive or routine ones. That's part of
Right.
our survival instinct.
Mhm.
You're more likely to remember those negative experiences and use them to frame up your present action, which then leads to a future that looks a lot more like the past
Mhm.
than something that we could start completely rewriting in a new way.
Right. And I
So
guess if you're always obsessing over your past mistakes, you're not focusing on new skills and your future and developing a path for yourself for success and making smart decisions if you are constantly thinking about your mistakes from the past. Right?
exactly. And there's
Yeah.
another narrative type that's the adamant narrator, which is very much believes that this always happens, or things never work out for me. That's
Mm,
very sure of that outcome. And it doesn't always have to be negative. Sometimes, of course, they think that they're right. But the adamant narrator is another type where the future action is driven by this feeling of, these are the parameters and they are unflexible and unchanging. And imagine
right.
what a future looks like if that is the narrative voice in your head.
Sure. So I'm going to ask you personal questions. Can you think of anything that you didn't accomplish in your life because of a narrator in your head that was holding you back? Can you think of anything?
You know what? The first thought that came to my mind when you asked that question is, I think it's more about how I process accomplishments
Okay.
and whether I feel satisfaction in them or not, whether I feel like I can truly own them. And so one of the reasons why, and you always, you're obsessed with my Emmys. And if you want, I'll just give you one, Deidre. I mean, I have enough of them. Um,
Uh,
but I always felt a little bit, I think I was raised to believe a couple of things. The first was, you may not be the smartest person in the room, but you can outwork anyone, which
okay.
led to what I would call the striving narrator, where like
Mhm.
I work and I work and I work and I work, and I worked myself several points in my career to a point of burnout. A striving narrator is never happy with your achievements because it always wants and believes that it can have more. And the second memory that I have is that I remember being told, a lot of our narrative voice comes from early experiences. And I don't know if you had this as well, but I remember being told, if you're good at something, you don't need to tell anyone. Like people know. People know. And if you talk about yourself, that's bragging. And of course, many women I know, particularly in the career field, we don't do a great job of amplifying our own achievements.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
then because of that early messaging, nice girls don't, you're conceited if you talk about yourself, you're bragging. And so they hide their accomplishments, or they downplay their accomplishments, and then they're surprised or shocked when someone else gets the opportunity or the promotion. So
Right.
when you
Because
ask
they
me
didn't,
that question,
yeah, because they didn't promote themselves at the
exactly, because we're
office.
not
Yeah.
comfortable with our own stories. So when you ask me that question about, is there anything I haven't achieved because of my narrator? I think I've always sort of battled against my narrator saying, you can't do this, or you're no good at this, because I have a very strong desire to prove things, even to myself. Yes, I will. Yes,
Uh-huh.
I can. But I have a hard time owning the accomplishments after. So when I'm introduced at a conference as, Valerie Gordon, 10-time Emmy winner, I'm like, oh God, like they're going to think I'm conceited. They're going to think I'm braggy. And so that's what makes it
No, they're
hard for
not.
me.
They're not going
That,
to think that.
but that's what my narrator
Uh-huh.
feels or believes. And
Right.
I believe it comes from early experiences. And I tell a story in the book about making the ski team as a ninth grader. And I made the varsity team. And I was such an awkward, like, ninth grader. And I lived in fear that, I would go through life without ever accomplishing anything and no one would notice me, but I didn't want anyone to notice me. And I
Mhm.
made the varsity team as a freshman, and the school paper interviewed me. And I was proud of myself. And I remember the day the interview came out, and all my friends were gathered around the cafeteria table and looking at it, at the newspaper, with my like god awful perm hair picture and a caption under my name that was a quote from me from the interview that said, well, most freshmen start on the B team, the secondary team. I made the A team, which I guess I said at some point in the interview. And then in black and white, though, it certainly looked a bit different. And my other memory from that day, and we're talking, this is, 35 years ago, was I thought that my friends would be proud of me. And instead, one of them said, "You're so full of yourself, you shouldn't brag so much."
Ooh, yeah.
And I don't remember anything else from that day, except I do remember that I ate alone. I ate alone in the lunchroom. And then, of course, my best finish on the ski team was like 32nd place at the New York State sectionals. And the next year, the team was canceled due to budget cuts. But the memory, that memory and that voice, "You're so full of yourself, you shouldn't brag so much," has stayed in my head as part of my narrator.
Yeah.
And that's why when I talk to people about identifying that voice and naming the voice and understanding that that's just a small part of you, I also talk about finding the origin story. When did you first start believing this thought? And it's just interesting to me that I can trace that feeling of discomfort around talking about achievements back to, sitting alone in the lunchroom as a 15-year-old and still feeling like what that felt like. So there's a number of ways that we can both identify and combat that inner narrator voice if it's holding us back. First thing, though, is to recognize that it's there. And I will tell you, Deedre, there are people I talk to, mostly men, not all men, but it's usually a man who says, "I don't do that. I don't have that voice in my head. I don't talk to myself." Can you imagine how much peace and quiet you would have in your day if you didn't have that constant chatter in your head?
Yeah, yeah. All right, that brings up so many thoughts. So have you seen the movie Violet?
I have not.
Okay, so Violet is a 2021 American drama film. It was written, directed, and co-produced by Justine Bateman, and it's her first feature-length film that she has directed. And it stars Olivia Munn, who's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous,
And funny.
and yeah, and funny. But her character is hardworking and successful. But throughout the entire film, there's this man's voice telling her that she's stupid and ugly and can't do this, and it's constantly negating what she feels and what she wants to do. So she's constantly doubting herself, and she's making these decisions that are the polar opposite of what she wants to do. And she mentions to a friend of hers over cocktails, "Don't you ever hear this little voice that tells you you're not good enough?" And her friend goes, "No, I don't hear anything like that. And if I did, I would know it was lying to me." And Olivia Munn's character is just completely blown away by this. Like, what do you mean you don't hear this voice? And even if you did, you would think it was lying. And her origin story, I don't want to ruin it for anyone, but it does trickle back to her youth, but also people that she's interacting with day to day treat her like garbage, and it's because she doesn't stand up for herself. And when she finally does, things turn around. And I highly recommend the movie. It only got like 3 stars, which kills me because her brother, of course, has been working on Ozark, which is fantastic show. But I think everyone's much more comfortable with drugs and murder and money laundering, but they don't want to talk about, oh, this little voice that
Little
tells
voice in
us.
our head.
Yeah.
If anyone's listening to this and you're a leader and you're like, I have no idea what these two crazy ladies are talking about with this inner voice, I think it might be helpful to do some more introspection.
Yeah.
The inner narrator isn't all bad. In fact, it thinks it's protecting us. It's very much a part of us. Where we want to be able to turn the volume down a little bit or reframe and rewrite the story is when it's getting in the way of our own success and satisfaction. And the movie that you referenced certainly sounds like that. Like this voice in this woman's head is clearly not helping her, and it's holding her back from the happiness and the success that she should truly have. And so when I say that the most influential character in your story, it's not your boss, it's not your mother-in-law, it's not, your partner who won't listen. It really is your own inner narrator, because it's not just how you talk to yourself, it's how you think. It's how you think and respond to all of these external elements. And that's what we get into in the book. And by the way, I don't know if you can see, so the cover of the book here, and I had an illustrator create these little thought bubbles over this woman's head. She's sort of stuck in her brain. It's called Fire Your Narrator, a storyteller's guide to getting out of your head and into your life. And the thoughts she has running around in her brain are, you're not good enough. This will never work. and I'm not ready. And what's sort of funny about those three thoughts, or sad, is that that's what I was thinking to myself as I was writing the book, because I had my narrator, whom I have named. I call her Squash, because she shows up at really inopportune times to squash my confidence. As I was writing this book, when you're writing, there's always a lot of self-doubt. Is anyone going to read it? Is it any good? Why is this not working? And she sort of sat there on my shoulder in my brain the entire time saying, you're not good enough. You're not ready. This isn't going to work. And I had to sort of prove her wrong. So one of my techniques to quieting that voice is to name it, to treat it like a character in the story, so that you can talk back to it, so that you can know that's not the true you. That's the narrative framework you've just always been inclined to use, so Squash,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
not helping me, I'm going to keep
Right.
writing. I'm going to get through it.
I wonder, so are you familiar with Elon Musk's Neuralink project?
I'm familiar with Elon Musk, but I don't believe I followed his Neuralink project.
Yeah, so it's pretty much there's a certainly a more complex way of describing this, but it's pretty much like a chip in the head, in the brain that can help. For instance, if you have a severed spinal cord, it would help, right? And that's a beautiful, wonderful, noble cause. But in the future, the concept is that we wouldn't need to communicate with words. We would be able to share intent, which seems like that would eliminate lying. But then I'm thinking, would that eliminate self-doubt? And what would society be like if no one had any kind of self-doubt or right? Like
Scary, right?
it seems dangerous, actually. We need some people to hold back a little bit. And to your point, it is supposed to protect you
Right,
in
right. Well, I
some
guess the
ways.
difference is, are we getting rid of self-doubt, or are we getting rid of our conscience?
Yeah.
That sort of,
Yeah.
that whole morality part of it. So it would be great, I think, if there were, just thinking about how we charge up Teslas and,
Yeah.
other electric vehicles, if there were a place, and let's say you did have that chip in your brain, and you can take all the anxiety and worry and criticism and like output it and like leave it like in a trash can receptacle for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
To sort of clear your mind. So I think, yeah, who knows, many years in the future, maybe someone will come up with that. In the meantime, though, before that's invented, I can offer two tips
Okay.
for anyone with really any of the, there's 10 narrative types in the book, but we can focus, let's say, on the critical narrator, because it's the most common. You said if you spilled your coffee on your equipment, you would call yourself a klutz, you'd sort of berate yourself, and then you wouldn't sort of be able to get over it. So I have two really simple questions, since we can't download in our brain and clear out the thought process. The first question is this: so what? So what? So what if you're a klutz? And then, you would think that through. Well, then I can't do anything right. Well, so what if you can't do anything right? And we would just sort of go through this process of continuing to ask the so what question until we're sort of talking in circles. And
Yeah.
we've certainly uncovered, worst case scenario, which usually comes down to women start saying things like, then nobody will like me. I'll be alone forever and I'll die alone with 13 cats. Like, that's where we wind up. And then I ask the next question, which is, now what? Now what? Okay, so you spilled your coffee and you're a klutz and you're going to die alone among 13 cats. Now what do you want to do with that? Because this is where we get into the active authorship of our next chapter. How much do we want that inner narrator, that narrative voice, to not only berate us for what we've done in the present, or to ruminate about what we've done in the past, but how much do we want it to actually control our future?
Yeah.
At some point, this is your story. You get to decide what happens next. Why are you letting your future be hijacked by this overly critical or doubting, questioning, ruminating, whatever type you have, inner voice? And I think just stopping to ask those two questions of ourselves, along with identifying the origin story. Why is this a thought, that I've had for so long? And is it still serving me? So, for any of your listeners to think about, what is that thing you keep saying to yourself or thinking to yourself that really isn't serving you?
Yeah.
And how do you want to rewrite it, or think of it in a different way?
Those are all wonderful tips. And I am going to ask you for some more tips. So in my upcoming book, I discuss about the importance of asking better questions or answering those old questions in a better way. But just because you're going around asking better questions doesn't mean that the people around you have caught on. So we're all going to be asked these terribly boring and intrusive questions, and we have to figure out how to maneuver around them. There are many people applying for jobs, and there is that dreaded, terrible interview question that says it's not even really a question, it's more of a demand. Tell us about yourself. And a lot of people struggle to answer that question. So, is there an easy formula that you recommend job seekers, what should they do? How should they frame their response so that they are more apt to get that job?
So that is a great question. And I love that you provided it with a scenario, because I think tell me about yourself can be answered different ways depending on the scenario. I
Mhm.
do think it's funny, as you said, that so many people struggle with it. Like, who should know you better than you? So if you're talking about strategic storytelling and the scenario is a job interview, then yes, I would say there is a formula, because what most people get wrong is they think tell me about yourself is their life story,
Yeah.
and they go on way too long. They start monologuing, and the person sitting across from them, or wherever the interview is taking place, doesn't understand why they're being told what they're being
Mhm.
told. So it's not just what you say, it's who you're saying it to and what the goal is. So if you're talking about yourself to a hiring manager and the goal is to get the job, then I think the three-pronged approach would be to give sort of a broad statement about who you are that includes what you do. Now, of course, we are so much more than what we do, but
Mhm.
what you do now or most recently as it relates to the job. I would definitely talk about a past story, a past success, again, that relates to the job. And the third prong to me would be to tie in with something that you know about the company that they value. So it requires you to have done some research first. And if there's a little more time, you can always get into a fourth part, which would be something unique about you or a hobby or something that makes you tick. But in order to be strategic, you have to basically, that question, tell me about yourself, they don't actually want to know about you. That question is like every other job interview question, which is why should we hire you over any other candidate?
Right. And that's
So
using empathy. It doesn't matter what's in your head and what you'd
yeah.
like to say. What do they want to hear?
What do they want to hear, but also what's authentic and
Yeah.
truthful to your experience? So where most people stumble with this is that they start at the very beginning. Well, after graduating from here, then I went and I did this and I did this, and then I took this job and I didn't really like that. And it goes on and on. And you start losing the impact and the details. Or the other mistake I've seen people make, and I highly suggest avoiding this. Some people think that asking a question back will help clarify that question. So they'll say, tell me what you want to know.
Mhm.
Really bad idea in an interview. Here's why. You've now given control of your story, how you want to tell your story, over to this other person who doesn't know you. What if they follow up with, well, tell me why you left your last job?
Yeah.
And you don't want to talk, you don't want to start there. So I say own your story.
Mhm.
Start with a description of what you do currently or most recently as it relates to the company. Share a success, something that you've done well or that's been important to you, and then tie in with what you're looking to do in the future as it relates to this job opportunity. That's why we're there.
Mm.
But if the scenario were different, if you're at a networking event, and I know you have a lot of tips because you've done so much networking, I'm curious to know that when you talk to people at a networking event and you say, tell me about yourself, or so what's your story? What do people say that gets your attention that you're like, oh, I love that. I want to know more about this person?
Oh, well, I never ask anyone to tell me about themselves. I actually I dislike that question. So I will ask people, I won't even ask them what they do for a living. I'll say, "What do you wish you did for a living?" And that's a completely different discussion because now I learned that they want to work on antique cars or wish they were an astronaut or an ambassador. Completely different than managing the Macy's down the road. And it's much more interesting. And anytime someone in the past would ask me what I did for a living, I would say I was a panda breeder, just to see their
Good reaction.
reaction. Yeah, and some people would immediately giggle, and of course, it would just take the conversation in a different, direction.
But is
Much
that
more
the first
memorable.
question you ask? I'm curious because it is a little awkward to go up to someone at a networking event and say, "Hi, I'm Deedre. What would you do if you could do, what kind of job would you wish for?"
What the easy transition is, hey, I'm Deidre, and I'm not going to ask you any of those old, boring questions. You want to talk about something different? And they always say, yes,
Yes.
please. I want to
Perfect
talk
lead
about
up,
something.
right?
Yeah,
I
you
love
just
that.
lead in that way.
Do train with corporations to understand the concept of multi-perspectivity, the multiple perspectives that you work with. Everyone comes from a different background, everyone has a different origin or upbringing story, but also this idea of the narrative point of view. If we all come into the same meeting, but we each have different our own way of looking at the world. Again, that
Uh-huh.
narrative point of view is our framework. It's how we filter information so that things that fit that framework, we tend to hold on to those. That's like confirmation bias, right? Oh, yes,
Right.
I think of myself as a mess. I've made a mess. Clearly, I'm a mess, as opposed to someone who might come in and they think differently. Oh, I spilled my coffee. That's a bummer. I'll clean it up and I'll get on with my day. Right. So there are
Mhm.
different ways of looking at the same scenario, but understanding that not everyone sees the world through our own lens. And that's
Yeah.
how I also do a thing on, who's the supporting characters in your story and
Mhm.
who's the evil villain. And then why so often are we the evil villain in someone else's story without even realizing it?
Yeah.
The example I would give is, let's say you're driving on the highway and two lanes are merging into one, and the manual, the proper protocol would be that cars take turns, but
Mhm.
the guy on your right is inching up and not letting you in, even though it's not his turn. And so you think, that guy's such a jerk, I'm not going to let him in, right? And you inch up as well because it's your turn and you know what's right, because he's the evil villain in your story. Who does this guy think he is? What's wrong with him? Everyone else is merging. And yet you don't know that in his car, who knows? Maybe he got a urgent call from his mother and he's on his way there, and he's hit traffic and he's very upset and he just needs to get there. And so he's going to try to get ahead, even if it's just one car length. And here's this woman on his left who won't let him in. What the heck is her problem?
Right.
And so understanding that, my perspective is not going to be the same as everyone else's, and I shouldn't make assumptions about their
Mhm.
story,
Mhm.
rather than automatically going to, I'm right, that guy's wrong, and he's thinking, I'm right and she's wrong. And that's another one of the more popular and funny narrators I explore in the book, is the arrogant narrator. And when I bring it up in the workshops I run, if I say, do you have an arrogant narrator? Most people are like, oh, I'm not arrogant.
Of
But
course.
that's because of the name of it. So let me explain to you what this sounds like. So, Deidre, is there one right way to load the dishwasher?
Well, my husband thinks there is. I
Okay.
don't. Right.
Okay. So he
Yeah.
believes his way of loading the dishwasher is correct.
Oh, yes.
Okay. And you believe that your way of loading the dishwasher is also correct?
Nah, I really don't care. That's probably a bad example. I just want the dishes clean and I don't want pools of dirty water because the dishes weren't,
Yes.
tilted the right way. That's all I care about. Just
Okay, and that's
done.
completely fair. Okay, so I'll give you another one. I will tell you that my husband and I both believe that we do it right, and sometimes I'll catch him like rearranging the dishes that I've put in
Mhm.
there because his way is right. When we have that feeling of my way is better and I don't understand why other people don't do what I do, that would be a
Mhm.
sign of an arrogant narrator. So another example would be,
Well, no, I totally get what you're saying because
yeah,
in my card game, I have the true false section, which is represents E for empathy and the acronym that I have on how to be more interesting than a cell phone. And the whole key point here is it doesn't matter what you know, it doesn't matter what you think is right. You got to get into the head of somebody else and accurately predict their answer. So what I use are true false questions, and that's the distraction. So people start thinking about the accurate answer. I'm like, it doesn't matter. You got to figure out what someone else is playing and bet points on their answer. And even if they're academically incorrect, if you match their answer, you win because you got in their head. And that's all that matters. And some of people really struggle with that because they're obsessed over, well, what's the real
what is
answer? I'm
the
like,
right answer?
doesn't matter. It
Yeah, that's
doesn't
so great.
matter.
That's a great exercise to really get you out of your own head and thinking about someone else's.
Yeah.
But the
hard.
everyday narrator is interesting because you want to have a certain amount of confidence. I'm confident that, when I get to the front of the Starbucks line, I know how to order.
Uh-huh.
So there's nothing wrong with that, right? We want to feel confident in our skills. Where it becomes arrogance is when we get frustrated with the person in front of us because they get called to the front, and that just now they're looking at the menu like, oh, what do I want? It's like, really? You didn't use your time in line to figure that out.
Yeah.
And almost as if, my way is the right way and I'm frustrated by your way. When you think about it in terms of working together and leadership skills, if a leader comes in with an arrogant narrator believing that they're the only ones who can do it right, imagine the impact on a
Yeah.
team. So
Oh,
that's just one of the other
totally.
descriptives in the book.
Yeah, and that requires a lot of EQ. They need to be so much more self-aware. I went to a conference several years ago, and I'm going to backpedal to another comment that you made earlier about somebody who doesn't have that voice that tells them that they're not that great, and how you thought like perhaps it happens more often with men than women. And I do see men tend to have a little bit more self-confidence than women do, but not always. And I went to this conference that was all about data and how to use it. Now, do you say data or data? Just
I
want to
say
make
data.
you say data. Okay. So it was a data conference, and there were mostly men at this conference. And they were all sitting at this reception, and the tables sat 10, like these huge tables. And I plopped down at a table of filled with men. There were nine guys there. And before I go into these conferences and networking events, I'll often think of a few questions to ask people. And I knew since these were folks that eat numbers for breakfast, I needed to come in with some sort of question that was numbers driven. And I had recently read about, have you ever been to the Wait But Why website?
No,
Wait, but why?
not
Okay,
familiar with
so
that.
there was a question on there, and it was the thought is that if you could create your next child by like their personality, you could build the personality of your child, figuring out certain skills, and you have 250 points to allocate towards your future child, and you would pick three categories. It would be IQ, like your child's classic intelligence level and ability to understand complex concepts, the EQ, like your child's emotional intelligence level, how good they'll be at like knowing and understanding people and human nature. And then the third part is grit, like a broad personality trait that relates to like work ethic and mental toughness, overcoming, obstacles. So you have 250 points to allocate. How would you build your next child this way? And then I flipped it and asked, how would you, if you could like cultivate your own personality and your own skills and assign these points, what would you do? So these numbers guys were, breaking it out. And of course, one person said, well, I'd like it to be perfectly equal at 83.33333333. But then, it was more of a discussion of what's more important, intelligence or emotional intelligence? Do you want your child to be happy where they're connecting with other people? But, if you have too much empathy, you're going to be distracted and you're not going to be able to get things done. And then does grit matter more because you need to be able to persist in the face of hardship? Like, how do you do this? And all the people were talking about what they wished they had. All nine of them felt like they needed a personality tune up and a skill tune up, and they wish they had something different. And this woman walked by that I've known for many years, and she thinks very highly of herself. And so we asked her the question, expecting her to say something similar, like, oh, this is what I wish I had a little bit more of. And she said, well, I would want the exact combination I have right now.
Love her.
And everyone, they all had those smiles that just quickly faded. Is that they were so expectant, they were just waiting for this awesome reply from her. And oh, okay, all right. And no, she completely lost her audience because she had no EQ. Really, I mean, very low EQ there. So I do have another question for you. You teach a lot of college courses and you deliver keynotes and provide powerful corporate training courses. Is there anything that you've learned from your students? I mean, you're out there providing all these tips.
Oh
What have you
gosh.
learned from them?
People really want to talk, they really want to tell their stories. So I'll speak at a keynote and there'll be a line of people afterwards wanting to talk to me, but they don't have specific questions. They want to tell me about them. And I'm a naturally curious person, so I tend to enjoy these conversations. But you'd be amazed, Deidre, or maybe you aren't, because maybe this has happened to you as well. The number of people who get very personal, almost intimate, very, very quickly when I don't know them. And I don't know, I think I give off this impression, or people say, oh, I feel like you're talking to me. I feel like you're talking about me. I feel like I know you. And then of course, because I pepper them with questions, having come from a journalistic background and my natural curiosity. But I had a woman, can I say this? I had a woman who came up to me after an event, and she had been I had really inspired her to think about her next chapter, because she had been having these health problems that had to do with her vagina. And I was just like, no, don't go there. So I think one of the things I've learned is understanding your audience and getting personal with people without overstepping a boundary that might not be comfortable for them, and allowing a conversation. Every conversation has to be twofold. Even that tell me about yourself question, it's not a monologue. There needs to be a back and forth. And so I think speaking to audiences, you've probably found this too, has made me more aware of the intake I need from audiences to best serve them. And I would say some people, when they come to tell me their story, are not aware of what they're putting out there. And how the receiver is receiving it. I felt for her. She had some challenges.
Clearly, I would not recommend talking about your genitals when you first meet anybody, unless it's a, gynecologist, perhaps.
And it would be
I mean, that's context. You just reminded me of something that I read about yesterday. I mean, you brought it up, you opened the door here, so now I'm going to talk about it briefly. I, over the weekend, worked out at this gym in Bethesda, and they had a steam room, and it just felt so good to then, get an ice cold shower after this really hot steam room. And I thought, I really wish there was something close by that I could go to, like a sauna and a steam room and all that. And I was looking up steam rooms, and I came across this business where they do vaginal steaming. Have you heard of anything like this?
I believe Gwyneth Paltrow might have spoken. I feel like that's a Gwyneth Paltrow goop thing, right?
It must be, I mean, possibly they didn't mention her at all, but at first I just had no idea what it was. And then I felt like, now I'm on this website too long, and the algorithms are all going to know that I'm on here trying to, I couldn't even figure out, like, how does this work? It sounds like a facial for it. And
my mom's gonna be like, vaginal steaming.
You brought up vagina. I'm like, speaking of vagina.
I know. That's what makes you the most interesting person I know, because of your love of knowledge and the details and the things that jump out at you. And maybe this might be a common practice, and we don't know. I think you should probably go experience it, so you'll become more familiar with it and be able to speak, as an expert. And what amazes me is that I know that there are challenges of open positions, employment positions around the country right now. Like, people are still finding it's calmed down a little bit, but like some months ago, it was like no one could get anyone to work anywhere. And there's help wanted signs everywhere. And yet you're telling me that this place is able to staff a vaginal steamist or two, many, because I don't know how they probably do this. I mean, how many do you need? But that this is something that they can find staff for, despite, the number of businesses that cannot fill their open positions.
Well, it's definitely an open position, Val.
And what kind of a degree or experience? Now we've gone off the rails.
Oh, we totally have. Well, and the thing is, she opened it up during COVID. Like, she launched this business during COVID and is still in business. And there's so many puns that I could throw out here with this, but I'm just not going to do it.
No, we probably
yeah. Okay. Now, are there any questions that you wished I asked you before I move into some of my questions from my game?
No, I guess not. I guess, well, you didn't want to know what happened to those high school girls, but to be honest, I don't know.
Oh, we don't care about them. Well, let's see. What are your pet peeves?
I think I said it already. My pet peeve is when you get to the front of the line at Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts or Subway and the person in front of you has not thought about what they want. And now they're holding up the line. Because I'm like, how did you spend all this time waiting and not figured out what you wanted?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really irritating. I don't like it when I spend all this time making a meal and I know it is perfectly seasoned. I know. And I realize seasoning is a matter of choice, but when my husband immediately douses it with hot sauce, I am
Oh, mine does
so
that
angry.
too.
Ugh.
Yeah. He just loves hot sauce though. I actually know that I do something that's one of your pet peeves.
What's that? Oh, I can't stand that.
I don't
Shoes.
do it like with like a public, like a magazine. So for anyone who doesn't have video here, what I did was I licked my finger to turn a page of my
Yeah.
book, but sometimes it sticks. I wouldn't
Uh-huh.
do it, let's say, at a doctor's office with a magazine, because that's kind of gross. But I know that that was a pet peeve of yours, and I realize I've been guilty of it in my own
uh,
personal house.
well, last week I was the opening speaker at an event and I decided to throw out some new bits for the audience. And I brought up another pet peeve I have, which is when people wear flip flops whilst seated in the emergency exit row on an airplane.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they always say, "Are you willing and able to assist in the
No,
event
you're in
of an
flip
emergency?"
flops.
No, you can't save the day in flip flops. Come on,
Oh,
come on. Yeah,
yeah, they
they were
they
cracking up
should
on
not
that.
be allowed. They should be replaced. I agree with you.
That's like, look at their shoes.
Those are
Uh,
not solid shoes in case of an emergency.
no, they're not. I mean, that's why superheroes, you just don't see them in flip flops
Right.
typically. First responders. Can you imagine firefighters showing up in flip flops? I mean, that's not going to work. Next up, what we're going to do is a couple of other questions from the very interesting game.
I
So
love this
remember
game,
the
by the way.
rules? Oh, thank you. Thank you. All right. So remember the rules: no politics, no religion, no ad nauseum topic du jour. In the answers, I'm looking for the most ridiculous, interesting, and creative answers when. So we are traveling on a spaceship together for 1 year. What amenities should our spaceship have for us? And to
Um,
be clear, we have plenty of toilet paper. That's not an amenity, that's a necessity. So we have plenty of toilet paper, and the ship is as big as like New York City.
okay, so we need every book that I've been meaning to read in the past 5 years, but haven't gotten around to.
Okay.
We need an ample supply of wine.
Yes.
We need some of our good friends that we have in common. They know who they are. And I don't know, just for fun, throw in a steamer of some sort and let's see how we use it.
Oh, that's great. Next up, scientists have figured out how to unboil a hard cooked egg. What else should they figure out how to undo?
I think that scientists should undo a false sense of confidence that people have when they don't deserve it. I don't
Yes.
like people who are so confident and yet I don't see. Look, I'm all about building up people's confidence, and I find that women in general who have every reason to be confident sometimes aren't confident enough. But I am perplexed by people who seem to have so much of it
Uh huh.
for no apparent reason.
Yeah.
So they don't have the IQ, they don't have the EQ, they don't have the grit. They've been kind of lucky to
Uh
get where
huh.
they're getting because everyone else is doing all the work. And I want to kind of, I think that should be undone.
Yeah. One of the things I struggle with is the premise of my book and card game is that everyone's a little bit boring. And I've met some people that really don't think they are. They think their personality sparkles. I'm like, no, actually, you have some things to work on, but no one's going to just walk up to them and say, you're boring.
Right.
It's just not going to happen.
Well, I guess
Just
what's the harm of them believing that they're not boring? It's really the harm is for everyone else who has to listen to that.
the next question is the hair on honeybees' eyeballs helps them detect humidity, determine how the wind is blowing, and pick up extra pollen. Pick a weird place to grow hair on your body and give it a fascinating function besides just being hair.
Wow. Where do you come up with this stuff, Deidre? Um, well, as we're getting at the idea of understanding everybody's narrative point of view and where they come from and what kind of empathy they have or what we need to know about them, maybe we could
Uh-huh.
have hair on our heart that absorbs their energy and tells us whether they are good people or what they might struggle with. I don't
Oh
really.
my goodness. I have never heard that answer before, Val. A
Yeah,
lot
well,
of
I'm trying to think of the kind of work that we do. I don't really want hair on my heart, but like, you know what I mean? That sort of reaches out and grabs
yeah.
that part and helps us better understand them.
Well, maybe it can be that unusual sort of clear hair that just sprouts overnight. Do you know what I'm talking about at all?
No.
You don't know what way to leave me alone, Val. So you don't get like
Unusual
this
clear
straight.
hair. I know hair that
It's like
sprouts overnight. I don't know about it being
no,
clear.
it's like a whitish blonde, just like 2 inch. You're just nodding at me.
Oh, okay.
You
No,
don't know
I
what
know
I'm
what you
talking
mean.
about.
I usually notice those things when I'm sitting in my car, like at a red light, and I look up at the mirror, and all of a sudden I didn't realize that like there's this hair has grown on my face, and only in that particular sunlight do I see it.
Right. And there it is. And
Yes, yes.
where did
Maybe
it
it's
show up
something like
from?
that. So that the hair in this scenario is almost like feelers, like tentacles. It can sense
Uh-huh.
emotions.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I always wanted extra hair in my ears that would tingle when someone's lying to me.
Yes. So same thing,
So
right? We want to get at people's inner notions and we're
yeah.
using hair to do that.
But I don't want, really hairy ears. Just maybe it's
Hidden
one.
hair.
Yeah, it's one special hair. A Nebraska man requested the Lincoln City Council rename boneless chicken wings a better descriptive, like wet tenders or saucy nugs. Give another product a better fitting name.
Okay, I just want to say I would not order any wet tenders. So a product that is really misnamed is wasabi.
Okay.
I think it should be called nose pain.
Nose pain or
Like, you know, when
not
you have too much
guacamole.
wasabi and it like hits you right in your sinus, or
Yeah.
sinus clearing nose pain and it hits
Oh,
you right
yeah.
here.
Yeah. How about was snotty?
Yeah. So you saw that video probably of the mom. I don't know if it was hot sauce or wasabi. She
Uh-huh.
gave like her 2-year-old daughter, she put a little like wasabi on her tongue, or the kid wanted it. So she gave it to her and she put it in her mouth. And a second later, this poor kid, I think it's like child abuse, goes, help. And then the video ends. Like it's just so sad. And she realizes how hot it is. And I thought this terrible mom. And then she uploads it because she thinks it's funny.
Yeah,
Yeah, wasabi can be quite painful.
did the Child Protective Services
I
show
don't. I
up?
hope so. What's going on? What's she gonna do next?
Oh, it's terrible.
Yeah, it was kind of.
Okay. And the last question of the day. What should have been invented by now?
You know what I would love to see them invent? I'm someone who I always thought I was going to be on one of those 30 under 30 lists, you know, and then you hit 31 and you're like, okay, but I can be on a 40 under 40 and
Uh-huh.
make that one either. And then of course, you know, you realize like you've sort of missed your opportunity. I think we should have like a, 50 over 50, 80 over 80. I mean, your chances get better as you go up, right? That the longer you stick around and you keep ticking and you keep
Yeah,
achieving that, you'll get your recognition. I think we need to
I
invent.
like that. I
Yeah.
like that. I've often said, one of these days I'm going to hit one of those lists. And I always pass the milestone birthday. And I used to say 100 under 100, but I like your 80 over 80.
Yeah. And we got
Yeah.
time. We got time to get there. I don't see there's any reason we couldn't both be on it.
Yeah. I love it. All right, Val, I think we're going to wrap it up there. For anyone who wants to buy Valerie's book, and yes, you should, it's Valerie Gordon, Fire Your Narrator. It is available on Amazon. There is another author by the name of Valerie Gordon. I'm sure she's a very
Not
nice
me.
person, but we're not promoting her book. We are promoting Fire Your Narrator. And Val, where else can people get in touch with you?
So they can find me at thestorytellingstrategist.com. And also I'm really active on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram as well, but I am most active on LinkedIn. Valerie J. Gordon. You referenced the other Valerie Gordon. She's a baker out in LA. She's been on Oprah. Every so often someone tries to connect with me on LinkedIn and they tell me that they love my cookies. That is not me, but LinkedIn or at storytellingstrategist.com, Valerie at storytellingstrategist.com.
For all of the listeners out there that want a more fascinating life, remember the narrator, that little voice in your head, plays a huge part in changing the trajectory of your life. If you want to change your past, and have a different future, start with the narrator in your head.